extra points in the macula compared to 30-2, and it gives points along the RNFL layers. And when we talk about OCT glaucoma analysis, most often the OptoView or the Zeiss Cirrus machines have been tested for glaucoma evaluation. There is not much literature on using other OCT machines for glaucoma. So my paper compares the structure function correlationship between corresponding RNFL thickness measured by a new SD OCT machine and Octopus visual field cluster analysis in normal and glaucomatous eyes. So the machines we are testing here are the Octopus 600 perimeter and the Octopol Revo 60 OCT. So the test in the Octopus perimetry is the cluster analysis test. What is the cluster analysis test? Basically, we know that the G points are along the clusters, and 10 such clusters have been identified by the software. In each cluster, the number of points that have been that are there, they are averaged out, and you get a single mean deviation for the 10 visual field clusters. So this is the cluster analysis. And if you see the OCT sectors given by the Octopol machine, there are 10 such sectors. And if we override, if we put the sectors and spatially correlate them with the Octopus clusters, we see that there is a spatial correlation shape like this. So each of the sectors on OCT representing a certain RNFL has corresponding mirror images on the perimetry Octopus cluster analysis. So we numbered the OCT sectors and the corresponding perimetry clusters, and our study was basically to see the correlation between these 10. For example, cluster 8 over here, just to show an example, in this OCT sector diagram, you can see the value is 97 microns, and the cluster analysis shows a mean deviation of 4.5 in the cluster 8. So this is how we correlated. So in our methodology, we prospectively selected patients between 18 to 70 years of age needing perimetry and OCT testing, and we classified them into glaucoma cases and normal eyes, which were controls. Any patients with non-reliable perimetry, OCT quality scan less than 6 or coexisting pathologies were excluded, and patients underwent detailed clinical and glaucoma examination. Glaucoma was defined as optic disc morphology with either visual field defect or IOP more than 21 or both. So our primary outcome measure was to see the correlation between each OCT sector and corresponding perimetry cluster. This was given by Pearson's correlation coefficient. A more than 0.6 was considered strong, 0.3 to 0.6 was moderate, and less than 0.3 was weak. Then we also compared the strength of association between the OCT sector and each perimetry cluster. This was given by the linear regression analysis and presented as beta coefficients. Our secondary outcomes were to see the predictive value of each OCT sector, that is having a probability of getting a significant field defect in that corresponding cluster and the ability to predict the occurrence of glaucoma. So this was done by logistic regression analysis and receiver operating curves. So in our results, we had 100 eyes, out of which 52 eyes were glaucomatous and 48 eyes were normal. The only significant difference between the two was the age group in which the normal eyes were significantly younger as compared to glaucoma. So this is a table showing my primary outcome measure of correlation and association. The left side shows the correlation analysis, and we can see that sector 2, 3, 4, 7, and 8 are all significantly correlated, out of which sector 3, 4, 7 show a strong correlation, while sector 2 and 8 show a moderate correlation. When we look at the linear regression association, strength of association, we also see sector 9 is associated. So there are 6 sectors which have a good strength of association between the two groups, out of which sector 3 has the strongest association, where a 2.71 micron reduction in RNFL thickness is seen with every 1 mean deviation increase in the same cluster. These are secondary outcome receiver operating curves. This gives us cutoff values and tells us how sensitive and specific each OCT sector is to either predict glaucoma or to predict the a significant visual field effect. And again, we see these 6 sectors, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 9. They all have significant predictive value, out of which the sector 7 and 8 are the most sensitive and specific, almost 80% sensitivity to pick up glaucoma. So basically, sectors 3, 4, 7, 8, they constitute arcuate fibers. They showed strongly significant result in our studies in terms of correlation, association, and predictive value. The 1 and 10 sectors are nasal radiating fibers. They showed no correlation. While 5 and 6 constitute the papillomacular bundle, they also showed no significant correlation. Out of these 3, 4, 7, 8, the 3 and 4 are the inferior arcuate fibers. They had the strongest correlation and association with corresponding visual field effects, while the superior arcuate fibers, 7 and 8, they had the strongest predictive value for glaucoma. So a sector 7 less than 106 microns and sector 8 less than 130 microns was highly suggestive of glaucoma. So to conclude, RNFL thickness on the Optopol Revo 60 SD-OCT machine correlates well with visual field analysis on Octopus perimetry, and the machine is capable of independently and accurately predicting glaucomatous visual field effects and glaucoma diagnosis. Thank you.
Hello, good morning, everyone. And first of all, thank you to the organizers of this conference for giving me this opportunity to judge this session. I have a question for you. You have correlated the OCT and Octopus findings. Did you even compare them with the clinical fundus findings?
Yes, ma'am. Each patient was evaluated clinically, and a diagnosis of glaucoma or no glaucoma was given by a glaucoma specialist based on previously published literature, where each a glaucomatous eyes was defined as that with typical glaucomatous cupping, either with a typical visual field defect on Octopus perimetry or a pressure of 21 millimeters or both. So this was the clinical criteria, and the typical glaucomatous disc cupping was taken from previous literature to describe whether the patient had glaucoma or no.
That's fine, but with the changes which you saw on OCT and you compare them with your Octopus, whether
Yes,
there was any change in the thinning of the retinal nerve fiber layers. Did you correlate that also?
yes, ma'am.
Did
That
it
was
match?
also Yes, ma'am. That also was done. It was done separately for glaucomatous as well as for normal eyes. And for glaucomatous eyes, it was the picture was similar to that with the overall, including the non-glaucomatous eyes also.
Okay.
So
And
because
did
of
you
lack
also did you also compare this Octopus findings with the Humphrey findings in any patient, like whether there's a marginal difference or a big difference?
No, ma'am. This Humphrey was not included in the study. It was just between Octopus and the OCT.
Was there any relation with the vision?
Yes, so we did include the vision, but most of the patients had a good vision in terms of Snellen's visual acuity. So there was no significant correlation, difference between normal and glaucomatous eyes in the vision.
What are the limitations of this study?
So there are major limitation is that we did not consider the normative database given by the OCT. So we only took the actual value in microns, whereas a normative data in which they code the each sector as red, green, yellow, that was not included in this study. And secondly, we did not consider the ganglion cell complex also, which is now considered an important factor in glaucoma diagnosis and evaluation. So we only considered the RNFL thickness in different sectors.
Another thing, the age matched controls were also, the age was not matching as it was shown.
Yes, sir.
That
So
was
age
also
was
one of the limitation.
right. So age was not matching, but all the data I have presented was overall eyes, considering both normal and glaucoma. And yes, age was significantly lower in the normal group, and that is understandable because glaucoma is more seen in the older patients. But the data I presented was in the overall group and separately for normal and glaucoma.
Okay.
Can we move on to the next presentation?
Yes.
Yes. Next.
So I think next in line is Dr. Matangi. I request her to share her screen and start the presentation.
Morning to one and all. Is my screen visible?
Yes, just make it a slideshow.
Yes, okay. Good morning to one and all. My name is Dr. Matangi. Today my paper is about comparison of optic disc perfusion in retinal peripapillary capillary using OCTA angioplex in glaucomatous and normal eyes. OCT angiography is a new imaging technique enabling visualization of microcirculation in vivo with high resolution. OCTA is based on ultra high speed sequential B scan of the same area of the retina. It provides functional information about the dynamics of blood vessel networks in vivo without exogenous dye injection. This technique estimates vascular peripapillary dropout and optic disc flow in glaucoma. It's a breakthrough because fluorescent angiography has no role in glaucoma. The correlation between damage of capillary around the disc and glaucoma has been proven. In case of progression, these vessels are extremely damaged. The figure shows the different areas that can be scanned. The first one is a whole end-face image. The second is the papillary region, peripapillary, and the disc area. Aim of my study is to compare the optic disc perfusion in the radial peripapillary capillaries using angioplex optical coherence tomography angiography in glaucomatous and normal eyes. It's a prospective comparative study and a duration of 1 year. Materials method, this study was conducted at Rajanayake Hospital, T Nagar, Chennai with Cirrus HD, OCT 5000, Angioplex software, Carlsys Meditech. Study population included normal subjects, a total of 68, and patient diagnosed with glaucoma, which were further divided into primary open angle glaucoma 25, primary angle closure 22, and normal tension glaucoma of 20. The criteria included CD ratio of more than equal to 0.5 and corresponding RNFL defect. Normal subjects included non-glaucomatous optic disc, no family history of glaucoma, IOP less than 21, and no quantitative observed motion on OCTA. This is an example of a normal patient OCTA showing a flux index of 0.429 and 430 in the superior inferior quadrant respectively. The overall flux index in this is 0.428. This is an OCTA of a glaucoma patient, which shows reduced flux index in superior and inferior quadrant, which is 0.293 and 0.295. The flux index overall is also reduced, that is 0.298. The distribution of subjects in my study is represented by this pie chart. The data collection technique included the best corrected visual acuity, slit lamp evaluation, IOP, gonioscopy, 90 diopter examination, visual field, OCT RNFL, and OCT angiography. So based on the vertical cup disc ratio, optic disc changes were classified into mild, moderate, and severe. Humphrey visual field analysis also classified the glaucoma into early, moderate, and severe based on Hodap-Parrish and Anderson classification. The results, this is a table showing the test independent comparing the mean values of flux index and perfusion percentage in each quadrant and overall between the normal and glaucomatous group, which shows significant reduction in flux index in all the quadrants in glaucomatous patients, whereas the perfusion percentage is low in superior inferior quadrant and overall. A similar test was done with primary open angle glaucoma between the primary open angle glaucoma and normal, and angle closure and normal tension glaucoma. All these groups showed similar changes. That is, there is a decrease in flux index in all 4 quadrants and overall, whereas the perfusion percentage was low in the superior inferior quadrant. The glaucoma group were also divided into mild, moderate, and severe glaucoma based on the visual fields. So the mild glaucoma showed only changes in flux index and not in perfusion percentage, whereas moderate and severe glaucoma showed both in flux index and perfusion percentage. The values were also compared with RNFL thinning. The RNFL thinning also correlated with the flux index and perfusion percentage. Flux index was also reduced in all the patients who had thinning of RNFL, whereas perfusion percentage was reduced in superior inferior quadrant. This is a receiver operating curve showing increased sensitivity specificity of the parameters in superior inferior quadrant for both flux index and perfusion percentage. Similar studies which were done with Chen et al. Study comparing peripapillary blood flow, which showed significant differences among the different groups and significantly correlated with functional structural defects. In Chen et al. Study about ONH perfusion in glaucoma, it quantified the peripapillary circulation as flux, vessel area density, and normalized flux. In Bojiken et al. Study, there was a significant reduction in primary open angle and normal tension glaucoma compared to the normal controls. In Grace and Richter's study, there was a stepwise reduction in RNFL microcirculation across severity. OCTA parameters had stronger association with structural rather than functional measures of glaucoma. So the recommendation according to my study is that the flux index values are found to be significantly lower in superior, inferior, and overall quadrants in each group of glaucoma. And so the flux index value is important. The flux index value of less than 0.3 and perfusion percentage of less than 40% is abnormal. The value of perfusion percentage provided by the software requires further evaluation, and the value also shows similar behavior to flux index. The superior inferior quadrant values are more significantly corresponding to the glaucoma defect. A limitation of this study shows that the values also decrease in other types of optic neuropathy. Further studies are needed to differentiate these values in each type of optic neuropathy and glaucoma. The effect of surgeries and anti-glaucoma medication were not studied in my study. The values of this study are based on the Angioplex software. Its relationship with values derived from the AngioView based on amplitude software is yet to be studied. Thank you.
Was there any relation with the vascular diseases or hypertension or like this?
Good morning, sir. Actually, we hadn't we hadn't taken the comorbidities of the patients.
Okay.
It was just based on the different groups of glaucoma and normal patients. We didn't include the comorbidities, sir.
Sure. You have taken into consideration the retinal nerve fiber layers, but did you also look for the ganglion cell layers?
No, ma'am. Ganglion cell
specific-
layers we haven't done, ma'am. It's basically we took the visual fields, the cup disc ratio, and the RNFL defects. The visual field and cup disc ratio was used to classify it as mild, moderate, and severe glaucoma. And the RNFL was used to compare the values like flux index and the RNFL values.
Those values you took directly, or you had segmented it manually also?
No, ma'am.
What
We
is
took
the
it direct.
accuracy?
We
Because
didn't.
many times they are not very accurate.
Okay, ma'am. Like we hadn't segmented it, ma'am. We just took it directly from the machine.
Because
The
then the
auto-
reliability becomes a issue.
Okay, ma'am.
Okay.
More questions?
Yeah. Next. Yes, you can
Go on to the next
proceed.
presentation.
Proceed.
Yeah. So I will now invite Dr. Neeta ma'am to present her paper. I will be sharing the screen on her behalf.
Good morning, everybody. At the outset, I would like to thank BOA for giving me this opportunity to present my view. It's a comparison between ease and outcome of retroiris claw fixation in a case of PC rent using AC maintainer versus a posterior segment sleeve. A study of 400 cases. Next. At a teaching institute wherein residents are taught skill transfer for manual small incision cataract surgery, commonest complication encountered was PC rent. The assisting senior surgeon was left with the choice of putting in a sulcus fixated IOL. When the PC support was inadequate, a choice between SF IOL and retroiris claw IOL was given, out of which the latter was chosen due to ease of IOL fixation. However, it was noted that AC maintainer used during the procedure was having some drawbacks over a posterior segment infusion sleeve. Next. This presentation discusses the merits, demerits of an AC maintainer versus posterior infusion sleeve and highlights which should be used when. Next. It's a retrospective comparative interventional analytical study. One arm uses the AC maintainer and the other arm uses the posterior segment infusion sleeve as the third hand to maintain the depth of the anterior chamber with infusion of fluid while using a 20 gauge occitome for vitrectomy. Sample size was calculated as 4Q upon D square, where alpha as 5%, which is the allowable error, and beta is 80%, which is the power of the study. It came to 384, but a 400 sample size was calculated with attrition rate of 5%. They were divided into two arms and difficulties encountered were assimilated. Next. All cases of PC rent were collected in the last 5 years from the MRO department. They were separated into those in which an AC maintainer was used during vitrectomy, and others where the posterior segment infusion sleeve was used. The associated difficulties encountered were listed: insertion of the sleeve with open wound, collapse of the anterior chamber during the procedure, how complete was the vitrectomy performed as checked with triamcinolone at the end of the procedure, Vitreous strands in the wound side port and at the pupil edge at the end of the vitrectomy. Ease of fixing the IOL. Retroiris fixation of the iris claw with infusion sleeves in place. AC depth all around at the end of the IOL fixation. Pupil dimensions oval or circular. Lenticular astigmatism contributed by the lens tilt. Cystoid macular edema causing drop in visual acuity, and the final BCVA. The results were tabulated and the inferences were drawn. Insertion of sleeve with open wound, it was easier with an AC maintainer, as it was self-retained, difficult to keep posterior segment infusion sleeve in place with an A2 vicrule in a hypotenuse globe. Also, one has to doubly confirm if we are into the posterior chamber and not between the retinal layers or subretinal. Collapse of the anterior chamber during the procedure, more so with an AC maintainer, as it distorts the cornea, could get plugged by the iris on which it rests, could get dislodged from its insertion as it is not anchored. How complete was the vitrectomy performed? Results were much better with the posterior segment infusion sleeve, because it is ergonomically more stable, allows the cut vitreous to fall back by titrating the flow and prevented by cortex or nuclear fragment pieces from falling backwards. Vitreous strands in the wound side port at the pupillary edge at the end of the vitrectomy. This was more dependent on the operating surgeon, but better results with a posterior segment infusion sleeve, as it allows the vitreous to fall back. Sweeping with an iris repositor or dialer was easier with a posterior segment infusion sleeve, as it did not interfere mechanically. Ease of fixing the IOL. No, go back. Ease of fixing the IOL with infusion sleeves. Here again, the AC maintainer caused mechanical interference. It rendered the AC or of unequal depth, and there was collapse of the chamber the minute the forceps was introduced to hold the lens before clipping. The depth of the anterior chamber all around at the end of IOL insertion, it was unequal in AC maintainer. However, it was almost equal in the posterior segment infusion sleeve. The pupil dimensions, the pupil was circular if we clip it beyond the iris collarette in the periphery. This was easier in a posterior segment infusion sleeve, as there was no interference to clipping in the periphery. Lenticular astigmatism contributed by the lens tilt depends on the operating surgeon again, but better astigmatic control was available with posterior segment infusion sleeve. It gave space to equivocally clip at the same peripheral level, and it allowed adequate iris tissue to be clipped so that IOL was more stable and resistant to tilt. Cystoid macular edema, more so with an anterior chamber maintainer. Because of the incomplete vitrectomy, lens tilt leading to lenticular astigmatism and greater phagocytosis with lesser clippage if too much in the periphery. In conclusion, need of the hour is to do a vitrectomy and put an alternative form of IOL. It could be a sulcus fixated and SF IOL, iris claw, and anterior chamber IOL. Iris claw in the retropupillary plane away from the corneal endothelium is the popular choice due to the ease of insertion. Most of us have negotiated this learning curve. However, putting in a posterior segment sleeve by an anterior segment surgeon is still in its infancy. Considering the merits and not so difficult learning curve, it seems to be the most logical thing to do. This paper was presented to create an awareness amongst the anterior segment surgeons to try this out to get the benefits of a better surgical outcome. Thank you so much.
Nice paper, Nita.
Thank you, ma'am.
I just want to know, what was your post-op follow-up of these patients?
Madam, we almost had these patients follow up with us for a year, and this was given as a thesis topic to one of my students, so we had all the data with us.
Okay, so what was the complication rate other than CME?
The visual acuity in almost 40% of the patients came to 6/6, but the remaining 40%, I would say, never improved beyond 6/9 part, and some of them didn't improve even beyond 6/18.
So why they did not improve? Means what were the complication? Was there any
I
RD
think,
at the end of 1 year?
chronic red eye, cystoid macular edema, and incomplete vitrectomy, probably. All three of them contributed to it. And most of the times we asked the patients to go in for another surgery, but they were not very much willing to do that. Some of them were happy with their 6/18 vision also.
Okay, so any patient who went for retinal detachment, because
Not really, ma'am.
because complications will depend just not on the
I
infusion
understand,
sleeves.
but no, we didn't have any
Okay.
retinal detachments in any of these patients.
Okay.
You
And
done
when
the
you did-
study. Okay, continue.
When you
Okay.
did this, both the methods of putting anterior chamber and the posterior, was the anterior chamber open?
Yes, ma'am. It was a small incision cataract surgery, so it was a tunnel wound.
Okay, all were tunnel wounds. Okay,
All of them were tunnel.
okay.
You taken the cases from the retrospective records, or you actually attended the cases?
So this was a thesis topic of my student, and cases were collected retrospectively from the MRD department, and then they were followed up.
If they are collected from the retrospectively, whether they were the things which has that steps and everything was recorded very nicely, or how it will be that every case will
So
be recorded?
we have a post intraoperative pro forma whenever there is a complication in which all the things have to be noted down. So there was a separate page attached to most of these patients who had a vitreous loss. That is the dictum
Yeah.
for the residents so that they learn from their mistakes. So we had all the details with us.
Hello, Dr. Neeta, nice paper. I just want to know whether the different seniors were involved with this posterior infusion cannula and the anterior chamber maintainer was used by the residents, or it was some consultants were using anterior chamber maintainer and some were using posterior infusion cannula.
There were different surgeons because some of them couldn't put in a posterior segment infusion sleeves. So most of the time when it was a posterior segment infusion sleeve, I was the one who was putting it in. And the anterior chamber maintainer was put. None of this was done by the residents. It was done by the senior consultants.
Okay.
One last question. In both the methods, did you take, even though it was small incision, did you take a suture in the wound before putting both of them? Because many times what happens, everything starts just coming off, AC collapses.
Madam, we could easily put the AC maintainer by putting in a viscoelastic, but sometimes I did have to close the tunnel when I put in the posterior segment infusion sleeve.
Okay. Thank you.
Because too much of hypertony, it is better to take a suture and then put in. But I found that putting in the posterior segment infusion sleeve definitely gave a better vitrectomy outcome as well as clipping of the iris glove. So I prefer to do it that way now after so many cases. Even that taking a suture and removing it at the end of the surgery is still worth it.
True. And what about the infusion rate? Once you put both of them, what rate do you keep?
When I do the vitrectomy, usually it is halfway through. And even when you're putting in the intraocular lens, the iris claw, you should put it midway through. Because otherwise there will be iris prolapse.
True. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much, everybody.
Ma'am, can I now invite Dr. Smith Snehal Sutti to present his paper?
My screen visible?
No, not yet. You have to start sharing your screen.
Is it visible now, ma'am?
Yeah, now you are. Just make it into a slideshow and then you can start.
Yeah.
It is. The slideshow is not happening.
Yeah, just give me 1 second. Is the screen visible now?
Screen is visible, yes.
There's some problem. I think I'm seeing the screen in duplicate.
Yeah, maybe you can just continue in this format.
Yeah, so a very good morning, everyone. The topic of my presentation.
You are Dr. Smith?
Yeah.
Okay. One is missing in between.
Yes,
Mukti.
so
Yeah.
that presenter will not be there. So the ones at
Okay.
the list that I had sent you, the
Okay.
highlighted ones are the presenters.
Okay.
Yes, continues.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. The topic of my presentation is the feasibility, safety, and clinical outcomes with a new design of hydrophobic capsular fixation IOL. Ma'am, I'm not able to navigate the slideshow.
Tech team, can you skip it, or should we just start with the next presentation and you want to just set your?
We can try 1 minute, doctor.
Sorry.
We can try it out. We can check what problem he has.
Yeah, basically, I'm not able to navigate from the first slide itself.
Okay, can
I'm
you
not able to go on to the next slide.
can you please click on share screen? Doctor, please share screen.
Let's start with the next presentation till then, and we'll take yours the next. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I invite Dr. Saugata Poddar to please start sharing his screen.
Yes, ma'am, I am audible. Ma'am, I am
Yes,
audible.
you are audible. You are audible.
Yes, ma'am. Okay. Is my slide visible, ma'am?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Okay. Thank you. Good morning, my respected judges, seniors, and my dear friends. I bring you warm greetings from RIO Kolkata. Today, I'll present a rare case on etivalvar conjunctival schwannoma. In our day-to-day clinical practice, we come across various conjunctival masses. Some of the common masses that we face are congenital like dermoid, inflammatory masses like scleritis, episcleritis, allergies like phylexten, caterpillar hair, vascular like hemangioma, traumatic, granuloma implantation cysts, degenerative like synchricula and cystic pterygium, and neoplastic like papilloma and OSSL. These masses take origin from one of the key layers of the conjunctiva. However, the neural tumors originating from the nerves of the conjunctiva are rare conditions. The neural tumors of the conjunctiva are the neurofibroma, schwannoma, and granular cell tumors. Schwannomas more commonly involve the peripheral nerve extremity, followed by vestibular schwannoma in the head neck region, and followed by orbital schwannoma. However, the epibulbar conjunctival schwannomas are extremely rare conditions. A 35-year-old male patient presented with a chief complaint of a mass involving the white portion of his right eye for the last 6 months. This was the size of the mass, appearance of the mass at his initial presentation. Patient was apparently asymptomatic 6 months ago when he developed a rounded pinprick mass which was gradually increasing in size over the past 6 months. There was no history of any pain, diminution of any vision. There was no history of any antecedent trauma or foreign body interaction or ocular surgery. This was the picture 1 month after initial presentation. There was no history of any similar episode in the past affecting either eye, no history of any other systemic illness, and no significant family history. General and systemic examination was within normal limits. Lymph nodes in and around the eyes were non-palpable and non-tender. Coming to the ocular examination of the affected eye, BCVA was 6/6. There was no proptosis. Eyelids were within normal limits. However, the patient was unable to close his lids at the later stage due to the mass effect. And for the same reason, the EM was restricted at the extreme left gate in the later stage. There was a solitary globular pinkish vascular mass of the size of approximately 8 mm into 6 mm with regular margins and smooth surface in the nasal quadrant of the right eye. There was telangiectasia seen on palpation with a cotton tip applicator. It was firm in consistency and freely mobile. Translumination was negative. Cornea was initially cleared. The mass did not encroach upon the cornea. However, in the later stages, there was exposure keratitis incidentally in the later stage. The other aspects of the examination was within normal limits, with RP was 16 mm and 18 mm respectively. To rule out in intraocular infiltration, we did UVM, which shows that there was no infiltration into the sclera. Preoperative blood investigation was within normal limits. So we planned for excision biopsy of the right eye conjunctival mass under local anesthesia, and the mass was sent for histopathological examination. This picture is showing the final condition of the mass at the time of surgery. The mass was totally excised. Mass was free from the scleral bed. The mass is globular in nature and well encapsulated. This was followed by conjunctival autograft on the temporal side, and the graft was secured with autolocus blood. Now the surprise came when the patient revisited us with the histopathological report, which showed that there is a tumor of neural origin and histological features are suggestive of schwannoma, and there was no evidence of any malignancy. This is the histopathological explanation. The postoperative period was uneventful. Patient was put on topical antibiotic and lubricant. After the histopathological evidence of neurofibroma, schwannoma, we did an MRI of the orbit and brain, which showed there is no orbital or brain involvement. Then we consulted the oncology department. They told us that this is a benign tumor, and the patient should be followed up regularly. There is no need of any other therapy. The patient was reported the dermatology department to look for any capillaris spot, and the patient was reported the ENT for any sensory neuron hearing loss. Epibulbar schwannomas are very rare condition, with less than 10 cases being described in the literature. Schwannoma of the conjunctiva is a benign encapsulated tumor found in isolation or in association with von Recklinghausen mutation. Immunohistochemistry shows positivity for S100 and HMB for this type. Treatment involves complete surgical excision along with the capsule. Lee Markido et al. Described the case of conjunctival schwannoma in a 37-year-old male patient. Tumor was S100 positivity. Angioli et al. Reported a perilingual mass provisionally diagnosed as a pinguiculum in a 68-year-old male patient, which later showed S100 positive. There has been only one case report from India, from LV Prasad Eye Institute, by Dr. Akshay Gopinath Nair, Swati Galki, Milind Naik. They reported a case of epibulbar schwannoma in a 12-year-old boy. These are my references. Now, what should be your take-home message? Take-home message, like however small or minuscule or insignificant the mass may appear to the ophthalmologist, preoperative ASOCT and EVM must be done to rule out any intraocular infection. And suppose there is a slightest doubt of scleral involvement, donor scleral gut must be kept in hand, and do not misguided by the appearance. HP might come as a surprise, and multidisciplinary approach to look for other systemic evolution may give us an important clue to come to a final diagnosis. I express my sincere gratitude to Bombay Ophthalmological Association for allowing me to present in this platform and my respected teachers. Thank you.
How many days follow-up was done for
follow-up was patient reviewed at 14 days with a histopathological report. Till then 10 next week asking for MRI orbit then, and I took the patient to the oncology department. I consulted with them. Then the patient was approximately followed for 3 to 4 months. And because of this COVID situation, I am contacting with him with over phone. I am asking him if there is any recurrence of mass, but there is no recurrence. Everything is fine.
What is the role of immunohistochemistry in such lesions?
Immunohistochemistry reconfirms the diagnosis because like appearances are deceptive. In histopathology, we see the morphological features, but immunohistochemistry definitely pinpoints the diagnosis. It's also expression of the HMB45 and S100 that is specific for any tumor of neural origin.
What was your post-op treatment? Did you use any antimitotic drops?
No, ma'am. I actually waited for the histopathological report. To us, it seems to be a papilloma, it's a benign condition, because there is no scleral involvement, there is no angry loop, or there is no infiltration. So we put him only on topical antibiotic. We waited for the histopathological report, but histopathology report shows it's a benign tumor, and we consulted the oncology department also. They told us this is a benign tumor, no need of any other further therapy.
Is there any recurrence rate for this?
Yes, ma'am.
Is there any recurrence rate reported in literature for this tumor?
No, ma'am, there is no report. No, there is no report of recurrence. It is mostly unilateral condition.
How common is this lesion? How commonly it is found?
It is extremely rare condition in literature. I searched in PubMed and other platforms. There is only 10 case report worldwide and only 1 case report from Eliposa Eye Institute. And actually, I was not sure because it is when the histopathological report came, then it was a surprise to us. I searched the literature, I read the books, and then it was a surprise that yes, we found this case. Then we did all the MRI and the further follow-up in medicine dermatology in the department.
On to the next presentation.
Yes.
Dr. Smith Snehal.
Yeah. I'll just share my screen.
Yeah.
Is the screen visible now?
Yes, just make it slideshow and then.
Yeah, so a very good morning, everyone. The topic of my presentation is the feasibility, safety, and clinical outcomes with a new design of hydrophobic capsular fixation IOL. Modern day cataract surgery has become a refractive surgery where the patients desire spectacle-free vision post-operatively. Most of the variables influencing post-operative refraction have been overcome by advancements in keratometry, optical biometry, and newer generation IOL calculation formulae. Refractive surprises, however, such as IOL tilt, rotation, decentration, PCO, and dysphotopsia continue to be a cause of patient dissatisfaction after a perfect cataract surgery. To overcome some of these problems, various capsule fixation lenses have been investigated. The potential limitations of these lenses are a difficult removal of OVD from behind the capsular bag, complicated designs, the requirement for special instruments, and issues such as capsulotomy tears, capsular block, iris shaping, and pigment dispersion. Therefore, the purpose of this study is to report the feasibility and safety of implantation of a new design of anterior capsule fixated IOL with swivel haptics, which is a single piece open loop hydrophobic acrylic IOL with a 6 mm aspheric optics bearing a 360-degree square edge and an overall diameter of 13 mm. The lens has 2 extra haptics at 3 and 9 o'clock position, which can swivel over a pivot. The feasibility of implantation of this lens has been verified in manual phacoemulsification as well as femtolaser assisted cataract surgery. After obtaining an IRB approval, we implanted this lens in 20 eyes. All the surgeries were uneventful and all patients were followed up for a minimum period of 6 months. The preoperative axial length, keratometry were within the normal range and IOLs of standard power were implanted. This is a surgical video demonstrating the implantation of the lens. The lens with swivel haptics can be injected through a regular cartridge using a regular cartridge through a standard 2.8 mm incision. After insertion, the lens unfolds and the swivel haptics can be rotated using 2 Sinskey hooks onto the capsulotomy, and this fixes the lens. Post-operatively at 6 months, the refraction was stable. The residual refraction was myopic and 60% of the eyes were within -0.5 diopters or spherical equivalent, and all eyes were within -0.75 diopters. Anterior chamber depth was measured with IOL Master 700 and was found to be stable. Also, the effective lens position was stable. This is a major advantage for multifocals and torics. Ultrasound biomicroscopy demonstrated the lens to be more anterior and just behind the iris plane as compared to conventional in-the-bag lenses. Thus, the lens acts as an anti-negative dysphotopsia lens as the distance between the posterior iris plane and the IOL plane is reduced, which is one of the theories of negative dysphotopsia. Another advantage that the lens offers is a good rotational stability. On dilated clinical photography, we saw that the IOL with swivel haptics was stable in position and no decentration, tilt, or rotation was observed. No eye developed PCO at the last follow-up. The internal aberrations revealed that the lenses were stable and no tilt or decentration was seen. Serial gonioscopy demonstrated no significant increase in trabecular meshwork pigmentation at the end of 6 months follow-up. Thus, the lens offers numerous advantages such as a simple design, easy manufacturing and packing, standard injection through a 2.8 mm incision, the requirement of no special surgical instruments or training, and can be used as in manual phaco as well as femtolaser assisted cataract surgery, as capsulotomy size is not a as the requirement of a perfect capsular axis, unlike a femtis lens, is not a prerequisite, and the removal of OVD from behind the capsular bag is easy. Also, the lenses provide a stable fixation with good centration, minimal tilt, dysphotopsia, and minimal pigment dispersion, and provides a good rotational stability for toric designs irrespective of the bag size. And should any explantation be required, the explantation is easy. So this is how Dr. Sri Ganesh, the inventor of the lens, got the idea. Let's hear it from the innovator himself.
One day I was riding my motorcycle and pondering about the various options. Capsulotomy fixated IOL. And then I reached my destination and parked my bike. And then I had a eureka moment when I could understand. Why not have civil haptic which fixes onto the capsulotomy for an intraocular lens?
Thus, in conclusion, the new design of IOL was found to be safe and feasible in manual phaco as well as flax, with high patient satisfaction and no complaints of dysphotopsia, PC, or change in glass prescription, and no complications such as haptic breakage, postoperative endophthalmitis, or uveitis seen in any of the patient. However, longer follow-ups and studies on larger cohort are required to establish long-term safety and efficacy and evaluate and optimize the new A constant. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Smith. It was very nice presentation. I just want to know what was the rate of uveitis, because this must be rubbing on the iris from behind.
No, ma'am, we did not observe any case of uveitis as such.
Okay. And how did you calculate the IOL power? Because once you're putting it ahead, there'll be some myopia, no? You said.
Ma'am, surgeon optimized A constant was used. And hello. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. The surgeon optimized A constant was used, which was based on the proprietary material used. So basically, it was a company given A constant, which was modified later by Dr. Sri Ganesh, the operating surgeon.
So post-op, you wanted to make the eyes emmetropic or myopic?
Ma'am, we wanted to make the eyes slightly to err on the myopic side. So we were targeting 0.5. So we achieved this in 60% of the patients. And all the eyes were within the targeted myopia refraction, which was minus 0.75 diopters.
Okay.
Whether this haptic is in the bag, the extra haptics are in the bag, or it is outside the bag, anterior capsule?
So the haptics are actually placed on the optic itself with a swivel. So once the lens is secured in the bag, then the haptics are rotated using two Sinskey hooks and they are placed onto the capsulotomy.
So they are on the anterior capsule?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. They are on the anterior capsule.
And that impregnation of extra haptics can also cause some changes in the IOL, because you are, putting it somewhere, long term, or some deposition of, some material.
No, the haptics are made up of proprietary material, sir. And as of now, we did not even observe any ovalization of the capsulotomy as well.
Yeah, that is true. But because visually we use one-piece lens, and when these extra haptics are put, there are some chances of getting pigments deposition or something on theoretical possible.
We did not observe, sir, any of these. The UBM, however, demonstrated the lens to be slightly more anterior. So this can be attributed to the haptics, extra haptics that are enclavated onto the optic of the lens.
This was on the hydrophobic material.
Yeah. This was a hydrophobic material. Initially, we started with the hydrophilic material, but we encountered a very high PCO rate of almost 28 to 29%. And now we are patenting this, and also a toric variant is also about to be released soon.
Okay, one question I had.
Yes,
supposing while doing capsular, for this you require a good capsular axis. Supposing your capsular axis doesn't go well.
Ma'am, actually,
can you still put this lens?
Yes, ma'am, we can still put the lens, because a perfect circular capsular axis as required for other lenses such as femtis is not that critical. because in lenses such as femtis, we capture the capsulotomy onto the optic. So it requires a perfectly circular axis. However, here even if the axis goes a bit haywire, and if it is still not perfectly circular and more on the oval side, we can still pretty much use this lens.
Supposing patient has a traumatic or complicated cataract, then we cannot use this.
No, ma'am.
You can still use it.
We have not tried.
Have
in
you
traumatic
tried?
No,
Okay.
ma'am. Because in traumatic cataract, usually the capsular integrity itself is doubtful. So as of now, we had excluded this patient. We had only used in senile immature cataracts.
Okay.
To invite Dr. Sneha Pakhre, the next
Thank you.
presenter, to please
Thank
start sharing her screen. Dr. Sneha?
Is my screen visible?
Not yet.
Is it visible, ma'am?
Yes.
Okay, can I start?
It's just saying double click to enter full screen mode.
Is it visible now?
It's not visible here. Yeah, now it is.
Okay.
Yes. Go on to the slideshow and you can start there.
Yes, yes, ma'am. Good morning. Here I'm presenting a case of capsular bag syndrome. So coming to the introduction, it is a rare complication of cataract surgery with intraocular placement, where turbid fluids build up between the posterior capsule, resulting in the decline in visual acuity. It is also known as capsular block or capsular axis block syndrome. Its incidence is 0.73%, which occurs within few weeks to months or even years after cataract surgery. The purpose of presenting this case is it is a rare and unique complication after an uneventful cataract surgery. 72-year-old male with history of uneventful phacoemulsification surgery of both eyes, 6 years back presented with the chief complaint of gradual, progressive and painless diminution of vision in right eye since 6 months. All the causes of gradual, painless and progressive diminution of vision were ruled out. There was no history of systemic illness as well. So coming to the visual acuity, his visual acuity in the right eye unaided for distance was 624, which was improving to 615 with the pinhole. The color vision of both eyes were within normal limit. On doing subjective correction, we found out that he was improving only up to 618 and near vision was N10. So coming to anterior segment examination, here you can see the white reflex behind the PCIOL in the right eye, while in the left eye it was null or pseudophakic eye with side mount posterior capsule opacification. The posterior segment of both the eyes were within normal limits. We went ahead doing posterior anterior segment OCT. We showed the hyperreflective homogeneous material between the posterior surface of PCIOL and posterior capsule with slight distension of the capsular bag, which confirmed our diagnosis of capsular bag distension syndrome. So performed right eye Nd:ARC laser posterior capsulotomy, and patient was given anti-inflammatory drug for 2 weeks and anti-glaucoma medication for 2 weeks. We performed his ASOCT after 1 week of the intervention. We showed the disappearance of the fluid between the capsular bag and the IOL. So here is the picture which compares before and after the intervention. Here you can see the fluid, while in the picture number 2, the fluid has gone. We performed this subjective correction after 2 weeks and the patient's vision in the right eye improved to 6.9 and near vision was N6. So coming to the discussion, it is divided into 3 types: intraoperative, early postoperative and late postoperative. Intraoperative CBDS occurs due to high irrigation pressure during hyperdissection. Early onset occurs because of retained viscoelastic material, while late onset occurs due to incomplete removal of cortical cells, which provides the reservoir for organic substances. Here, the anterior opening created by continuous curvilinear capsular axis can adhere to the IOL, which shows traces of the fluid behind the IOL. Residual cortical cells then undergo metaplasia and proliferation, secreting alpha crystalline proteins, which creates a turbid milieu. It is again divided into 4 types: Type 1 shows transparent capsule and transparent liquid in the capsular bag, where in type 2 there is homogeneous milky fluid in the capsular bag, but the posterior capsule is transparent. In type 3, the fluid is either transparent or semi-transparent, but the posterior capsule is opacified, while in type 4, both the fluid and the capsular bag is opacified. So Blasenko et al. Has recommended the following treatment for different types of CPDS. Type 1, we just need to follow. In type 2, if patient is symptomatic, then we do Yak capsulotomy. Otherwise, we can just observe. In type 3, the Yak capsulotomy is recommended. And in type 4, Yak capsulotomy, unless the inflammatory symptoms develop. If patient has inflammatory symptoms, then we can consider topical anti-inflammatories and surgical aspiration can be performed. So take-home message of the case is, though the incidence of CBDS is rare, one should always have a suspicion. And clinicians should watch for inflammation, as rare cases of P. acne endophthalmitis have been reported following DR treatment, possibly due to release of sequestered low virulent organisms in apparently normal looking eye. Thank you so much.
How do you differentiate between endophthalmitis, where you get correction behind the IOL, and this?
Ma'am, patient usually has inflammatory symptoms in case of endophthalmitis, while in CBDS the inflammatory symptoms are absent. Then secondly, we can do, if even the slightest suspicion is there, we can do irrigation, bimanual irrigation aspiration of the fluid, and the fluid can be sent for culture for the organism, which will confirm the diagnosis of endophthalmitis.
And secondly, when you do,
Endophthalmitis can be non-infective also. So how you will differentiate
Yes,
in between?
sorry. Sir, usually it is usually associated with P. acnes endophthalmitis, where the picture is very typical. We can see the thick posterior plaque on the PC. While in case of CBDS, we will on slit lamp examination, if it is done meticulously, we can see the turbid fluid which has accumulated. So it is a clinical evaluation which will help us.
Is the reason for getting all these lesions? Why do you get all this milky fluid? From where this will come?
Sir, few studies I have done in which one of the studies has done electrophoresis of the accumulated fluid, which has shown that there is accumulation of alpha crystalline and gamma globulins are absent. So, which concluded that alpha crystalline usually comes from the lenticular epithelial cells, which are remaining after the surgery. And the absence of gamma globulin proved that there is no role of antigen antibody reaction in hypersensitivity reaction. So it is mainly the remnant lenticular epithelial cells from which the fluid.
This lenticular cell.
Yes, metaplasia and proliferation.
how you differentiate capsular phimosis from this capsular phimosis syndrome?
In capsular phimosis, there won't be accumulation of fluid. The only thing is optic will be adherent to the edges of the capsulotomy, ma'am.
How will you compare the treatment of Yak capsulotomy and pars plana vitrectomy and aspiration of fluid and sending it for histopathology?
Sir,
What will you compare? How will you compare? In this case, Yak capsulotomy was done.
Yes.
But what are the advantages of pars plana vitrectomy and aspiration of fluid?
Sir, the main thing is if we don't have suspicion of endophthalmitis, then pars plana vitrectomy will be invasive procedure, while in Yak capsulotomy it is OPD based procedure. And the advantage of pars plana will be that we can send the fluid for culture, which will show the organism if it is there, which can't be done in NDR capsulotomy. So in case of invasiveness, pars plana is inferior, but it will give the exact reason for it. We can send the fluid for electrophoresis as well as for organism culture to confirm endophthalmitis.
Rupturing the capsule with Yak will spread if the infection is there in the vitreous also, and it will turn in even more serious conditions. So it is just the same whether you are doing by Yak or by any other method. You are bursting the capsule. and you are making it to go in the posterior portion of the eyeball.
So that is
So-
what. So before doing the procedure, only the surgeon should do a meticulous examination of the patient, and if any case of doubt, we should proceed with pars plana vitrectomy only. Here in this case, it was a very quiet looking eye, and patient has only diminution of vision since 1 year. Nothing else was there. So we performed NDR capsulotomy.
Okay.
Can we move on to the next presenter?
Yes.
So I don't see Dr. Arpit logged in, so we will. I will request Dr. Sheikh Nagur Chandni to start sharing the screen.
Ma'am, am I audible?
Visible and audible, you can start.
Good morning, one and all. Today, my topic of presentation is a case of systemic lupus erythematosus with retinal manifestations. History: a 13-year-old female child who is a known case of SLE with lupus nephritis, taking treatment since 2 years in outside hospital, came to pediatric department with a history of 2 episodes of GTS types of seizure, referred to ophthalmology OPD for ophthalmic examination. Positive family history is present. General examination: patient is conscious, coherent. Patient is poorly built and poorly nourished. Paler icterus pedal edema is present. No clubbing cyanosis, kyphoscoliosis, lymphadenopathy is present. Discoid skin rash on the trunk and extremities and swollen knee joints are present. Vitals: pulse 82 beats per minute, blood pressure 140 by 80 mmHg, respiratory rate 18 cycles per minute, temperature is febrile. Systemic examination: CVS S1, S2 sounds heard, respiratory lungs are clear, no added sounds are present. Investigations: child is positive for anti-nuclear antibodies, anti-DS DNA antibodies, hemoglobin percentage is 5 gram percentage, CT brain is normal. Local examination: position of head is in midline, facial symmetry is bilaterally symmetrical, position of eyeball in orthophoric position, extraocular movements is full free, painless in all direction in both eyes. Ocular findings: in right eye, best corrected visual acuity is 660, conjunctival congestion is present, cornea clear, IOP is normal. In left eye, best corrected visual acuity is 636, conjunctival congestion is present, cornea clear, IOP is normal. Right eye fundus media is clear, optic disc normal in size, shape, margins are clear, vessels mild arterial narrowing and sheathing of vessels is present, FR is elevated, hard exudates are present. In central retina, large cotton wool spots and hemorrhages are seen. In left eye, fundus media is clear, optic disc normal size, shape, margins clear, vessels mild arterial narrowing and sheathing of vessels are present. FR is altered. Central retina shows large cotton wool spots and hemorrhages. These are the fundus photographs. Right eye showing elevated macula with hard exudates, and central retina showing large cotton wool spots along with hemorrhages. In left eye, FR is altered along with large cotton wool spots and sheathing of the vessels. Discussion: systemic lupus erythematosus is a multi-system autoimmune disease predominantly affecting women of childbearing age. The female to male ratio is 12:1, prevalence of around 28 cases per 1 lakh. Class 2 HLA-DR2 and HLA-DR3 has been the most consistent genetic risk factor, but HLA-DQ and HLA-DR allele are also show association with SLE antibodies. Articular and systemic disease: the skin, mucous membrane, joints, kidney, brain, serous membrane, lung, heart, and occasionally gastrointestinal tract may all be involved. Arthritis in SLE can be divided into deforming and non-deforming arthropathy. Constitutional symptoms consist of fever, malaise, fatigue, weight loss, lymphadenopathy, and anorexia. Various cutaneous manifestations include photosensitivity, butterfly or malar rash, painless or painful oral ulcer, diffuse alopecia is also seen. Coming to ophthalmic manifestations. Ophthalmic manifestations are common in 1/3 of the patient, commonest being keratoconjunctivitis sicca, but sight-threatening posterior segment and neuro-ophthalmic diseases are also seen. Occasionally, SLE may cause orbital inflammation and present with acute proptosis, lid edema, conjunctival ingestion and chemosis, reduced ocular motility and elevated intraocular pressure with myositis and panniculitis also reported. Lupus retinopathy was first described by Beckmeister. The classical clinical picture is of cotton wool spot, retinal hemorrhages, and vascular abnormalities like arterial narrowing with capillary dilatation and venous dilatation and tortuosity. Additional features may include retinal edema, hard exudates, and microaneurysms. Retinopathy is usually bilateral but may be asymmetric. The clinical appearance is of widespread anterior arterial occlusion and capillary non-perfusion. Subsequently, neovascularization is common but may be complicated by vitreous hemorrhage, retinal traction, and detachment. The occurrence of vaso-occlusive disease is strongly associated with presence of antiphospholipid antibodies. Vaso-occlusive retinopathy usually present with visual symptoms such as reduced visual acuity, visual field loss, and distortion. Other retinal manifestations of SLE include an unusual bilateral pigmentary retinopathy that may be resemble retinitis pigmentosa, but it is proposed to be ischemic in origin. Optic nerve disease is uncommon. The spectrum of disease described include anterior and posterior ischemic optic neuropathy and acute optic neuritis, which is also a result of ischemic in origin. Prognosis. Visual prognosis of retinal involvement depends on pattern of retinopathy, and vaso-occlusion usually lead to poor visual outcome. Reviews of retinopathy and choroidopathy pointed out that these two entities are indicative of guarded to poor surveillance. Treatment of ocular disease. In SLE, control of systemic disease often improve the ophthalmic disease. Mild
last 10 seconds.
Anterior segment inflammation may respond to topical corticosteroids or topical NSAIDs. In more severe anterior segment inflammation such as scleritis or disease affecting the posterior segment or orbit, systemic treatment is required. Significant retinal vascular occlusion associated with antiphospholipid antibodies may be treated with warfarin or low-dose acetyl salicylic acid in addition to immunosuppression. Retinal neovascularization usually requires pan-retinal photocoagulation. Persistent vitreous hemorrhage or traction retinal detachment may require vitreoretinal surgery. These are my references. Thank you.
Thank you, Chandni. I just wanted to know how you differentiate this from Eales disease.
In a SLE, we investigations are all more main points. SLE have that. And Eales disease only involve veins, retinal veins. In SLE, both arteries and veins are involved.
And your vision was less in both the eyes. So did we do OCT of macula to see what is the reason for decrease in vision?
It may be CMV.
So OCTs were not done?
Yeah, ma'am, we are not done because patient is uncooperative. Her general condition is not that good.
Okay.
Any other questions, or should we move on to the next presentation?
Yeah. We'll move on to the next.
Sheikh Nagur, please stop sharing your screen. Yeah, now I invite the last speaker, last presenter. I think Dr. Arpit has been absent. I don't see his login. So I invite Dr. Chandni Chakrabarti to present the last paper of the session. Judges, you might have to add her name because she was added later on because one person had got adjusted for the different session. Dr. Chandni, please start sharing your screen.
My screen is visible?
Yes, just make it slideshow and you're audible also.
I am audible also. Okay, thank you. Very good morning, everyone. My topic is monoocular elevation deficiency, which was previously called double elevator palsy, and it is itself a very great challenge for the strabismologists. I have no financial interest in this presentation, and all photos are presented with informed written consent. Monoocular elevation deficiency presents a surgical challenge to the strabismologist in terms of the number of surgeries and poor compliance of the patients. It is further complicated by the presence of associated horizontal strabismus and complex ptosis. So why this study? The purpose of the study was to analyze the outcome of a series of 14 patients with MED managed surgically by a single surgeon, that's me. To find out the factors influencing the outcome was also done. So a series of 14 MED patients were selected, and thorough preoperative evaluation was done. The surgical procedure, postoperative course, complications, final outcome, and follow-up pattern was noted. Here are some of the pictures of our patients. You can see most of the patients are having very large hypertrophy of the MEDI. Now the results, the age range from 6 years to 18 years, 8 were female and 6 were male. The right eye was involved in 57% of them. Amblyopia was already set in 85.71%, which signifies the delayed presentation of the patients. And also there were associated horizontal strabismus complicating the surgery in 71.43% of the patients. 2 patients were already operated somewhere else, and the surgical planning included correction of the strabismus in the first stage and ptosis correction in the second surgery, where the patch-up surgery for the residual strabismus was also done. 6 of the patients underwent bilateral surgery in the first stage because of the presence of large horizontal strabismus. Second surgery was needed in 6, that is 42% of the patients for squint. Only 3% of the patient, only 21% of the patient, that is 3 of the patients, need additional strabismus correction. Now the results, the follow-up was a very big challenge. Already 50% of the patients were lost for follow-up after the squint surgery. They did not come for the ptosis surgery. Out of the remaining 7% who did their follow-up meticulously, 86% had orthophoria achieved after 1 or 2 surgeries. So this is a result of one of the patients. You can see in the preoperative photo, there is a large hypertrophy of the left eye along with ptosis and jaw winking. Now this is after the squint correction. That is the first surgery. The orthophoria was achieved, and then this is after the ptosis surgery. That is the second surgery, where you can see the jaw winking was also improved much after the surgery, and there was no leg of thalmus on closing of the eye. Now this is the final outcome. You can see that the elevation was much improved after the surgery, and the surgery done was partial NAPS procedure with inferior rectus recession, because it was more than 40 prism diopter of hypertrophy in the left eye. So only NAPS procedure could not help. So we had to do both the procedures in the same sitting. This is another patient. You can see here there is left eye MED, and jaw winking is also present in this patient. And this is the outcome after the squint surgery. And this is after ptosis surgery. You can see preoperatively there is a significant jaw winking present. After the ptosis surgery, jaw winking was done. Very nicely corrected with the ptosis surgery. The surgery for the ptosis was done bilateral levator LPS disinsertion with bilateral frontalis sling surgery. This was the classical surgery. So we can see that delayed presentation and loss of follow-up were 2 major challenges affecting outcome in management of the MED, because none of the patients achieved their binocularity after the surgery also, even after the achievement of the orthophoria, due to the deep amblyopia present. and proper counseling about the need for 2 or more stages of surgical outcome may
1 minute remaining.
Follow-up and also improve the follow-up rate. So a precise preoperative workup, meticulous decision making, and proper counseling about the multiple surgeries and need for long follow-up can enhance the surgical outcome in monocular elevation deficiency immensely. These are my references. I thank my previous institution for these cases, and thank you. Stay safe.
Yeah, thank you, Chandni. Nice presentation
Thank you,
and
ma'am.
good results. Just wanted to know what was the binocular vision and achieved in these patients. What was done to make it achieve? Because some children were very small, 6 years.
Yes, only the 6 years child, that is a small one. We achieved binocularity of that is stereopsis of about 120 second of arc, and BSB was also normal in that case. But other cases we did not achieve. And in none of the cases we achieved binocular single vision. They were having the suppression in the strabismic eye, and also there was no stereopsis present in other patients. Only one patient we got 1/22 of arc, and we started amblyopia therapy for all. But after 6 months follow-up, the patients were also lost for follow-up. Other patients were also lost.
Any exercises or anything was given for binocular vision?
We gave patching or classical amblyopia therapy at that time, because these are all from remote areas, so they did not have the access to the computer or desktop, so they could not get any computer-based exercises. But we did the patching for everyone. 2 hours per day patching for everyone.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think you can stop sharing your screen, Dr. Chandni. So I think we have come to the end of the first pre-paper session. A big thank you to all the presenters and all the judges. I think it was a very tough competition with very nice presentations from all the participants.